Welcome back to the Wealth Effect. Today, we're talking about data centers, but the actual byproduct they produce, not the main product. For decades, the data center industry has been governed by a singular metric known as power usage efficiency, which effectively measures how much energy is wasted on everything that isn't computing, which includes cooling as the primary culprit in the equation. However, there's a shift going on, evaluating these assets because we're seeing the rise of heat as a service, which is a massive thermal output of high density AI clusters is being reclassified from a waste byproduct to a revenue generating utility. In the past, the goal was to simply release the heat into the atmosphere as efficiently as possible. But in a world where energy prices are skyrocketing due to wars or AI workloads, that waste heat has become a high grade thermal energy that is capable of powering small towns, warming industrial greenhouses, or even supplying land based aquaculture. This transition effectively turns the data center into a dual purpose that generates for the digital economy and the physical economy. Today, we're going to specifics of why there might be a thermal ROI coming soon that might matter. To understand the scale of this opportunity, we have to look at the sheer physics of modern computing, where a single high performance AI rack can now consume upwards of 100 kilowatts. And a lot of it eventually gets converted into heat to prevent the hardware from failing. And historically, they've used air based cooling systems that were pretty much everywhere, but they produce a low grade diffusion of heat, which was difficult to capture and transport, making it effectively unviable for a second use. The industry started rapidly pivoting towards liquid cooling and immersion technology, which allows for much higher rack density, but also a return waste heat in the form of hot water at temperatures ranging from 110 degrees Fahrenheit to over 140 degrees Fahrenheit. This specific temperature range is a pretty good sweet spot for heating networks, particularly in North America and Northeastern Europe in the rustic belt cities, where data centers can primarily be the thermal anchor for the entire town. Data centers are now looking into signing 20-year agreements to provide heat to cities or even greenhouses that isn't just lowering their carbon footprint, but also diversifying their revenue along the way from pure credit towards an actual infrastructure of these systems. The economical friction from this actual transition has been the last mile thermal delivery. But as the regulatory space shifts, particularly in Germany's new Energy Efficient Act, requiring new data centers to utilize at least 10% of their waste heat by July 2026. We're seeing the emergence basically of a negawatt, which is a negative watt, and a thermal credit, where the efficiency gains of not having to generate heat via natural gas or boilers is now being priced in the valuation of the data center itself. And this has become a nightmare to track down, but a dream for asset optimization, as it requires an understanding of cooling efficiency ratios, which is how you measure how effective a system removes a heat per unit of electricity consumed. If a facility achieves a high CER while simultaneously selling the removed heat to a third party, the effective cost of the power of computing drops tremendously. This creates an interesting competitive advantage where data centers located next to small town utilities or a food production hub can lower its energy prices for training AIs simply by venting its heat into the system rather than into the sky. Computer ROI is traditionally measured by the revenue generated per teraflop or per virtual machine hour, but it's highly volatile and subject to boom and bust cycles of the tech industry and with hardware obsolescence as well. Thermal ROI, however, is a bit more consistent, which is an essential service with high boundaries to entry and long term price stability. When we look at the capital expenditure required for these facilities, often ranging from 8 to 12 million per megawatt, the ability to reclaim and sell 70 to 80% of that energy as heat sufficient changes of that energy as heat, we're seeing companies that aren't just looking for cheap land and fiber optics, but a strategic scouting of locations where they can have a potential thermal outtake. They can look into building circular ecosystems where a data center heats a greenhouse that grows produce, which is then processed using the power from the same local grid, creating a closed ecosystem that appeals to the growing demand of ESG compliant investments. However, what remains still pretty crucial is how these systems are managed, especially when municipal governments are involved, as the risk of standard assets remains high if these tech companies don't have the 30-year lifespans that's required. They'll have to ask themselves whether the complexity of becoming a utility provider is worth the marginal expansion, or if it introduces too much regulatory red tape to keep the industry moving fast. Then turning their massive energy consumption into a source of affordable heating for houses and food production is perhaps one of the most green engineering feats that could possibly be achieved within the next few months or year. It redefines the data center's pretty much silence and terror in the background to a more useful source for the local communities that house them. And while we've talked so much, especially in the news, about the energy that's consumed in sheer gigawatt hours that AI needs, it's rarely discussed the evaporation discussion that's prompting taxes on local water supplies. Recent data from Westwater Research suggests that data center water consumption is projected to surge by a staggering 170% by the year 2030, which doesn't sound like much, but a lot of town planners should keep their eye on it. This isn't just about water being used to generate the electricity, it's about the actual withdrawal required to keep these clusters from melting themselves out of existence. We're seeing that people are starting to measure the true cost of AI models that isn't just measured in credits, but in the specific number of milliliters of fresh water that it's literally evaporating into the air from a single prompt. To understand why this is a mounting risk, we have to look at the sheer physics of how modern hyperscaling facilities operate, especially with those that are located in high stress watersheds like Arizona, Texas, and North Virginia. While traditional air cooling systems are still pretty much staple in these old server racks, the high density requirement for high performance AI trained models use evaporating cooling system. When models like ChatGPT or the latest Gemini process a complex inquiry, the heat generated by those GPUs is transferred into a water-based cooling loop, which is used to evaporate and inject the heat into the environment. A study from late 2025 indicated that a single 100-word email generated by a local LLM can sweat off over 500 milliliters of water, which is essentially almost a 16-ounce water bottle. And when you multiply by hundreds of millions of daily requests, you can see a straw effect that quickly draws down local water reserves at a rate that directly impacts its residents and agricultural needs, which leads us to a potentially controversial, but not really, proposal of a hydraulic tax. A policy shifts where regulation would begin valuating evaporation costs as a direct business expense. The current model offers massive tax breaks for data centers while they are disconnected from municipal water usage. Some economists are now arguing that AI companies should be taxed based on the hydraulic footprint per infrastructure, kind of like a carbon tax, which would force developers to prioritize water efficient architecture over pure scaling and size. Imagine where an API can price in how much of the local water supply it is consuming while the AI engine is humming. It'll basically draw data centers into water rich regions like the Midwest, where water costs a fraction of a cent, while the same prompt process in arid deserts can carry a premium because of the local environmental impact. This would create a market driven incentive for companies to move their scale development away from these water scarce area and towards region where water availability can support the weight of this AI boom. Companies like Microsoft and Google have pledged to be water positive by 2030, meaning they intend to replenish more water than they've consumed. But the replenishment often happens in different regions from where they've actually consumed it, creating a geographical imbalance of this consumption and replenishment. Perhaps moving towards a closed liquid cooling system that ejects the heat into the municipality rather than into the atmosphere. By eliminating the evaporation stage of the cooling, data center theoretically can put the data center into a zero consumption, though it does have a lot of capital expenditure right out the bat. And then there's why big tech companies are buying in the rustic belt. In 2026, the primary bottleneck of the global economy has shifted away from scarcity of high bandwidth memory and H chips towards the more stubborn obstacle, which is the actual physical power grid. We have reached a point where the lead time for a new high voltage transformer or utility scale expansion is stretching into 5 to 7 year range, which essentially is the whole lifespan of a phase, and especially for AI, where modern AI models are evolving every 6 months. This desperation has led to ruthless investments in these failed industry towns across the rustic belt of America, where they aren't being evaluated necessarily on the real estate or the charm of the small town, but for the standard power assets hidden beneath the factories. Corporations are now acquiring entire town sized footprints simply to gain immediate legal and physical access to existing grid connections that were once hidden under massive steel mills and automotive assembly plants. And we have to look at the massive disconnect between the speed of digital innovation and the physical infrastructure that is permitting it. When an AI company looks on the map, they aren't looking for population centers. They're looking at a heat map of legacy industrial power capacity that were left behind in the 20th century that has a lot of high voltage infrastructure, like a defunct paper mill or an aluminum smelter, represents a fast pass through regulatory nightmare of interconnection queue, which currently has 2 terawatts of global capacity awaiting for approval. By purchasing the land that the corporate entity holds a grandfather utility contract to, a giant tech company can bypass half a decade of environmental impact studies and gain grid stability simultaneously. Interconnection valuation is simply where a megawatt is ready to plug and play, and the power is appraised at 5 times the value of the actual land it sits on, effectively turning a worthless industrial field into valuable assets. When a $1 trillion company buys a failed town, they often inherit a community that has been hollowed out for decades by deindustrialization. And there is a very real risk of energy colonization, where the data center sucks the local grid dry while providing almost zero local employment. A data center, unlike any physical industry, doesn't need thousands of workers. It needs just a handful of security guards and a few technicians. And the physical impact of these towns is very complex as well, because there will be a sudden influx of big tech tax revenue, which can be a double sided sword that leads to rapid gentrification or a complete dependency on these big tech companies. If a small town sells its power rights today, they'll get a massive inflow of money, and it might find itself unable to attract any other form of industry to its town because the energy ceiling has already been reached by these data centers. And this is where we're seeing these host towns being ruined. We see local councils often lacking the technical experience or expertise to negotiate these high voltage buyouts effectively. We're seeing cases where small towns are selling their grid priority for a one time cash infusion that barely covers their existing pension liabilities. From an investment perspective, the clear winners aren't the towns. It's the AI companies that are specializing in these acquisitions and snapping up the titles to these defunct industrial sites. This can shape the idea of prime real estate and completely change scarcity across. We're also seeing how special power zones, where the federal government steps in to nationalize or redirect these standard assets towards strategic computing reserve, potentially lead into a legal showdown between property rights and national security interests. And as we wrap up today's episode on modern data centers, for years we've been told that the cloud is essentially weightless and somewhere in the air. But now we're seeing that it actually has a physical footprint. We're moving into an era where giant tech companies are also being evaluated on their thermal outtake agreements and power permits, whether it's turning waste heat into utilities or navigating these new taxes and regulations. And now most of us are asking, how does this AI impact our environment physically? Thank you for listening. Until next time.